And for those of you just getting on the line with us, good morning and or good afternoon, depending on where you are. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We'll wait until about 10:01 today to get started. We've got a huge number of you that are registered, and it looks like about 30% or so are in right now. So we'll give everybody else just a few more moments to join us. Wow, looks like a big number of you just jumped in just now. Good morning and good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started in just a second. And in fact, I'll share just a quick story with you about business continuity. And this may seem like sort of a funny one, but one of my favorite clients on the business side, not actually on the school side, is a company that is a small-ish, startup-ish company, if you will. I won't tell you who they are because I'm going to tell you a story about them. But they do some work in the car space, and they, long story short, have about 500 or so employees. They're nationwide. They have some really unique challenges. And when we started to do the business continuity process for them, I started like I start almost every continuity project. And I had their entire executive team in the room. I had our points of contact, obviously, in the room. I asked the HR team in whole to join. I asked a couple other teams to be there. And I said to them, what's critical? What can we not sustain this business without? And of course, they all raised their hands and said, me. And then they raised their hands again and said, my department. And then they raised their hands and said, my assistant, my this, my that. They were very self-focused. And it's ironic and it's funny, and it's also sometimes even scary. Because when we look at business continuity, part of the conversation involves actually intentionally having parts of our staff and in the school world, parts of our faculty too, not on campus, not working for maybe a few days, maybe a few hours, maybe a few weeks, in order for the rest of the business to be able to actually sustain whatever the emergency is. And so when we start talking about it, especially when we're in front of a leadership team, it can be almost natural to say, well, in order for us to continue, in order for us to be successful, I must be around. You have to have me. And I get that. I very much do. And what I'll challenge you to do as we go through the conversation today is to really think about any areas where it's not you, but it's others that are absolutely necessary, and feel comfortable being a little bit vulnerable and feel comfortable saying, hey, you know what? In this particular case, I may not be necessary for a few days, or I may not be necessary for potentially even longer. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Chris Joffe, and I'm the founder and CEO of Joffe Emergency Services. We are sort of together today to talk a little bit about the continuity team. And we're on this mini series right now where over the last 5 Thursdays, we've talked about various teams: search and rescue, first aid, reunification, attendance, and we're ready to talk about continuity. And we advertise this team as a team that many of you may not even know existed. And in fact, it's frightening and it terrifies me, but it's true. For many of you, the continuity team is a second thought, an afterthought, something that you may not even know exists, much less, even if you do, you may not have in place. And so this is one of those webinars where I very much hope that you ask questions, get involved, and be engaged throughout the presentation. But then I suspect, and I actually will challenge each of you to go back and watch this one, not just 3 times. And for those of you who are new on the series, we've suggested that you watch it once with us together here, the second time by yourself applying the concepts of the webinar to your school. And then for the third time, that you actually present this webinar to the team, whatever team it is, search and rescue, first aid, continuity, and have them sort of engage with you and use the webinar as a training tool. Well, I'll ask you to actually watch it a few more times, because for those of you especially that don't know what a continuity team is yet, or haven't really formed what that process or thought actually looks like, it's important that you internalize each component of this and that you really figure out a way to bring this from, all right, this is a great idea, to, all right, let's deploy. So with that, I will be the presenter today, and we'll be answering questions throughout our conversation. So what I'll ask you to do is, if you have questions, go ahead and post them on the right-hand side of your screen. If there are questions that I can answer quickly during the presentation, I very much will. Otherwise, somebody else may answer them for you by chat. And then, of course, at the end, I'll stop and or a couple times in the middle and make sure that we've answered any questions that are out there. So let's go ahead and dive in. Today, we're obviously going to be talking about the continuity team. So we'll talk about what the team does, who actually belongs on the continuity team, essential equipment, what do they actually need in order to do their job, communication, as we've done throughout the entire series, who do they communicate to, who do they expect communication from, and finally, we'll talk about some challenges that most continuity teams will face. So what is the continuity team? The continuity team is really fascinating because as soon as we evacuate, and I'll take you into a scenario now, let's say there was a fire in your main building. And if you've got multiple buildings, then you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, let's just say you have a fire in your building. And the fire causes the fire alarm to go off. Let's put it in the kiln on the second story. And so the fire obviously causes that area to need to be evacuated. The alarm goes off, we evacuate the entire school, and we end up in whatever parking lot, athletic field, wherever we may go. And now we're outside. Well, for most of us, when we look at emergency preparedness and when we look at planning, it actually stops there, right? We get everybody outside, we activate search and rescue, we find anybody else that we missed, we activate attendants, we have them find out for us who, if anybody, wasn't accounted for, or isn't accounted for, I should say. First aid takes care of the people that need to be taken care of. And for some of us, we even challenge ourselves by taking that next step and thinking about reunification and actually putting the kids back together with their parents. Most of us don't think about how we actually return to the buildings. And the challenge, or the reason for that, is that after a drill, we just jump back into the classrooms, or we go back to whatever it was that we were doing before. And so for a lot of us, it's just not natural, it's not necessary to think about, well, what would happen if this building were actually burned down? Or what would happen if this building were now a crime scene and we couldn't return for 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks? And that's what the continuity team does. So the fire department, when you call 911 and you say, hey, there's a fire, they're often referred to as the folks that run into the burning building and take care of the fire, they put it out. They're important, they're necessary. Well, the continuity team is just as important, and what they're going to do is they're going to put out the metaphorical fire, and that is, where are we going back to school tomorrow, or this afternoon, or next week, depending on the emergency that we're talking about and dealing with. We may have a number of different options or needs in terms of where we're actually going to go. So where are we going back to school becomes the most important question that we could possibly ask. And how are we going to actually facilitate that process? And that becomes, again, a very important question, and one that we just can't afford not to have answered. So the continuity team will figure that out. They'll work with the school leadership team to make sure that we actually know what returning to class looks like. And I'll talk about this in a scenario in just a second. But frankly, they're the very reason that we're able to go back to school, get back to safety, and move on with our lives, with our day, with our week, depending on what the emergency is. I'll share with you just a quick story. I had a kindergarten, and this didn't really impact the entire school, although yes, the kindergarten was at a school. And it was the first day of school, it was in September, and there was a bomb threat that was received, and the kindergarten was off in its own cottage, essentially, and I don't know why I couldn't think of that word. But the kindergarten's off in its own cottage, and the rest of the school was somewhere else. Well, the cottage received a bomb threat on day 1 of school. And as soon as they did, they said, okay, well, we need to call the police. That was the right thing to do. They evacuated because some students had already been dropped off at this point. They closed or secured their campus so that no further students could come onto campus. And they basically waited for further directions at that point. Well, it turns out that the bomb threat shows up, and the bomb squad rather shows up, and the bomb squad says, you know what, you should really send them home for the day. We'll do our work, we'll do our investigation, we'll see what's going on, but let's get the kids out of here for the day. Difficult transition for a kindergartner, not to be able to come back to school the day that they were planning for, or come to school for some of them even the first time, the day that they were planning for. And so you can imagine that had a whole number of issues that went along with it. Well, day 2 rolls around. Day 2 at about 6:15 that morning, there was a bomb threat that was called into the same cottage. And so again, we're in this situation where we have to say, okay, well, what do we do about this? And so the school decided, you know what, we'll go ahead and close today. So the school closed kindergarten, first grade, second grade, everybody else stayed open. Now, day 3, this time at about 6:45 in the morning, a bomb threat gets called in and the bomb squad has to come out. At this point, now we've delayed the start of school by 2 days. We're thinking about whether we want to delay it by a 3rd day. And the head of school's having, and rightfully so, a big challenge thinking about how we can actually delay the start of the school year by this much and what to do. And so we decided, rather than actually go to school in the cottage where they would normally go to school, why don't we break up the group? It was about 45 kids. Why don't we break up the group and have them in groups of 9 go to different houses that are on this street. And in this particular case, it was difficult, it was scary, it was challenging, there was some code compliance issues, there were all sorts of other issues. But that was one of the scenarios that was posed. Well, then they said, okay, well, if we can't do that, or if that's not ideal, well, what if we just sent groups of 20 to different schools? So we have one group of 20, another group of 20, and then a smaller group, and or 3 groups even. And we said, okay, well, let's look at that. What other schools could we send them to? And it turned out we didn't have any partnerships in the area. No, we didn't really have a lot of good options. And so then we said, okay, well, what about hotels? And so we got on the phone with some of the local hotels and they said, okay, you know what, we do have a big boardroom that's available and we could actually have you go back to school there if you wanted to. And so from about we'll say 7:15 that morning until about 10 o'clock that morning, the teachers from the kindergarten cottage, as well as a couple others from other parts of the school, ran to this hotel, immediately started decorating this boardroom, and it went from a corporate style boardroom, which literally had been the host of a big event for a big corporate group the day before, to a kindergarten classroom. And that's business continuity. And albeit that was a very sloppy and difficult and hasty approach to it, but the fact of the matter and the goal that we're after in business continuity is resuming normal operations, or something that resembles normal, as quickly as is humanly possible and in a way that's safe and actually matches or embodies the mission and the overall goals of the school. And that's what excites me so much about business continuity, is it's always this new, different challenge, and there's always an opportunity to do something a little bit differently than you did before. What's also challenging about it is that you always have to plan for it. You always have to be thinking ahead and thinking, well, what would I do in this particular situation? So who makes up the continuity team? Generally speaking, it's 3 groups of people that need to be involved in the continuity team. The first and the most important group is the technology group. And I say most important, I don't know why, because they tend to have the most to do, the most planning, the most concern. And in all honesty, they tend to be the people who are thinking about this and perhaps even pushing you to do this for years and years and years. But when they call it a disaster recovery strategy or a disaster recovery plan, you or your school leadership team has said, no, let's not do it. It's not worth it. I don't want to, whatever the case may be. Well, they tend to be the people that are not very excited when we put this new light on it and say, well, it's an emergency preparedness program and it's a business continuity plan. They go, oh, well, I've been pushing it for 10 years and nobody ever would let me do it. So they're not always excited to be there. So make sure that you allow them or sort of push them to feel important and as though they're a leader in this group, and they very much are and need to be. The technology that goes along with the business continuity plan, in the kindergarten example that I shared with you earlier, obviously there's not a whole lot there, right? If we can get the kindergartners there, we can get some food there, and we can set up something that resembles a kindergarten classroom, those kids are going to be fine. Well, let's take this a step further. Let's look at a high school. And let's say that we have to close a high school because of a fire or because of a crime scene or anything else. What we end up with there almost immediately is a huge number of people that we have to try and figure out how to A, move, B, connect to the internet and whatever other systems they use regularly, and C, teach. And more often than not, especially as we get into the upper grades, and really this starts even in kindergarten, in order for teachers to teach, they need some form of technology, whether it's a smart board so that they can present their plan, or it's a computer system so that they can actually access it. Let's say it's Haiku, so that they can actually access their own lesson plan and display it and use it. They need some sort of technology. And so again, this team this part of the team, rather, the tech part, is one of the most important. And again, the one component of it that you want to keep happy throughout the entire process. And to be fair, the one component of it that you want to make sure has plenty of coffee in the event of a real emergency or real activation. Beyond technology, and not all schools have this, and so if you don't have educational technology, that's okay. But ed tech, a lot of times people refer to it as, can be the group of people who help combine the sort of lesson plan with the technology that's available to your school. So put differently, if at the beginning of the year you're thinking, okay, we're going to offer these 42 classes, and you're trying to figure out exactly what the best way is to offer those classes, or what some ways are that you can help track and manage accountability, oftentimes the ed tech people will come in and will help you figure that out, and obviously they do that from a technology perspective. They're also going to work with the regular technology people, and sometimes they might be the regular technology people, but they're going to work with them to make sure that the actual educational technology that you need is set up and working. So if we go to that hotel room and we set it all up and we say, hey, you know what, in order for this to work, in order for us to deliver class today, we need a smartboard and we need this X, Y, and Z technology to be accessible, it's up to them to make sure it works. And finally, we've got the business office. All business continuity events essentially have one thing in common, and that is that they cost money. In order for us to move from one school to another, transportation costs are incurred, leasing and rental costs are incurred, other costs are incurred just because of the fact that we've got things going on in a different place than they normally are. Food costs are often incurred because anytime we ask people to do something that's out of the ordinary or abnormal, I like to feed them. And that's not necessarily a firm rule, but generally speaking, it's a good idea to at least think about. And there are all these other costs that go along with it as well, from a technology perspective, from an HR perspective. Salaries are oftentimes modified during this time, and so on. Now, aside from all of that, we also have the literal cash continuity piece of this, which says, hey, if I don't have enough cash in the bank at any point in time to make this transition for 2 months, 2 weeks, 2 days, then we might be in trouble. And so the business office really kind of has a couple of different areas that they need to be able to oversee within the continuity response. The first, again, just delivering the cash to make things happen. The second, making sure that they've got a strategy in place, and this generally comes and should come long before the continuity response, but making sure that we have a strategy in place to actually have access to that kind of cash. They also are responsible for payroll. And so at the end of the day, if we can get all of our people, staff, faculty, students, to a hotel room or anywhere else, that's great. But if we can't pay them because we don't have the people or the checks or the stuff to make that happen, they're not going to stay there. And so they've got that role. And then beyond that, they help with the overall compliance and regulatory bodies and things like that they actually oftentimes do just on a regular basis. But each of those components is very necessary. Again, regular technology, educational technology in the business office. And for some of you, you may end up with a continuity team that's just 3 people where you have all 3 of those areas represented. For some of you, if you're really small, you might end up in a place where all 3 of those are one person. It doesn't matter how many people it takes to make that up. What does matter is that you have somewhere between 3 and 7 people on the team. So if one person handles technology and ed tech and one person handles the business office, my suggestion would be to go out and find another person who's at least tangentially related to that and get them involved as well, because you really do need a team of 3 in order to bounce ideas back and forth and in order to actually have enough people to put something into action. One of the challenges that I often find is that emergencies, and again, I'll talk about fire, earthquake, and lockdown type emergencies, right? They involve our entire campus. They force us all to do something, generally get outside, evacuate, take attendance, and so on. Well, we have the benefit of the emergency there. And so we actually have some very clear and concise default responses. So in a fire, the default response is, hey, if I hear the fire alarm, well, I get out of the building. In an earthquake, hey, if I feel the earth start shaking, well, I drop, cover, and hold. And then I get out of the building. And in a lockdown, if I hear this directive given to me over the PA, or I receive a text message on my phone, well, I do what the directive says. And generally speaking, it's lock down or shelter in place or secure campus or whatever the case may be. Well, those default responses allow the incident command team or incident commander, depending, to not have to over communicate, or actually not even have to communicate at all directly, so long as those default responses are delivered, and or default sort of calls to action are delivered one way or another. Well, business continuity is still an emergency, but there are very few default responses. The only thing we know for certain is that the continuity team is definitely going to need to help us resume overall school, right? They're going to need to find us space and make sure that we have the money and make sure that we have the food and everything else that it takes in order for us to go back to school, whether on our own campus or somewhere else. What we don't know is where that's going to be. What we can't predict is how many people will have to be involved in that relocation process. If this is an event that happens at 10:15 in the morning on a Thursday, it's very different than an event that happens at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday, right? Because at 10:15 on a Thursday, I've got to move everybody from point A to B. Whereas if it happens on Saturday, I just have to communicate to everybody that they're going to move themselves from point A to point B. And generally speaking, just the action of getting that communication out and delivering the information that we need takes somewhere around 3 to 7 people. Now, if you end up with more than 7 people on your team, you'll probably end up with too many people contributing and not being able to move quickly enough through your decision-making processes. Although I certainly wouldn't fault anybody for having an 8 or 9 person team. It tends to be a little bit less productive. And again, that's just really dependent on your school and the environment that you live with anyway. So what do you need if you're on the business continuity plan, or rather on the business continuity team? You need a business continuity plan. You need the ability to actually look at a document that says, this is what we're going to do in this type of emergency. And you need to have that ability and have that built into you immediately. Because if you don't have the capacity to just reference a plan and say, here are the vendors that we have partnerships with, here are the other schools we have partnerships with, here are some of the other options we have available to us, more often than not, we end up having to look for those things or try to find those things in the moment. And that can be really difficult to have to do. Once they've got a plan, and we'll talk a little bit more about the plan, and don't worry, that'll be very much a next step for us today. But once they've got a plan, then they've got some questions to ask. And in fact, as you're building your plan, you even have some questions to ask. On the technology side, one of the first questions I always ask is, does your school provide any sort of school-sponsored technology? Any laptops, any iPads, any iPhones? I don't know of any schools that provide iPhones to students, but nonetheless, does your school do it? And if so, what is the result of losing access to those things, A? And B, what does that look like if you were to have to move all of those to another network? And I won't go on too much about this, because on the tech side, we can really, well, I'll end up on a tangent and we'll never get to the rest of the presentation. But the quick question to ask is, could we move, let's say, 800 laptops from our campus to another campus, and would that campus have enough energy within the network to actually supply internet and all the programs that we need for it to do? It doesn't matter whether you provide or not. It may or may not, depending on how many students you have. If you have 100 or less students, you generally speaking can show up on another campus with school-sponsored or student-sponsored laptops and have no problem. If you've got 1 to 600, there's generally going to be a problem, but you could probably plan around it. If you have 600 or more students, you're generally going to be one of the bigger schools in your area, and looking to try and find another school that could actually accommodate you from a network standpoint will get more difficult. What you can do, though, is you can look around at some of the big businesses in your area. So if you're up in the, let's say, San Francisco Bay Area, and we'll put you, well, I won't put you in a specific region, but some of the big businesses that are in that area are obviously tech companies, some startups, some very established. Those are great places to look, because those places all have a very robust technology infrastructure. They happen to also be in the middle of this wave. And if you're not familiar with it, we call it the Google office around here. But basically, open space, lots of conference rooms, lots of group collaboration areas. And believe it or not, those work perfectly for class and for school. And so you may want to look at somebody like that. If you're a really small school, a small hotel, and I'm talking really small, might be able to be just fine for you. And again, if you're a really big school, there are two components that you're looking at. The first is, where else can I look? Where else can I go? How can I get more creative? If obviously I can't stay within another school because it's just not going to have the resources for me, well, where else could I go? And that's businesses and so on. The next question that you really want to start to ask, and for many of you, your boards have already asked it, is how far away are we from full redundancy? So put differently, if everything went down, if all of our technology, all of our lights, all of our everything falls down in an earthquake, well, how far away are we from actually being able to access our network? And what does that process look like? How long does it take? If the process is just a couple of hours, and believe it or not, for some schools it is, then you're probably okay. You could probably stay on campus, and even if you don't choose to resume school the next day, you might have that option. If the answer to that question is a couple of days, couple of weeks, I don't know, then you're probably not. You probably really need to look at what other things you can do from a tech standpoint to help make your system more redundant, more accessible, more available. Now, the next question that I like to ask, and this is again more towards the planning process than it is the actual activation or response process. But the question is, what do we need versus what makes us amazing? I have to tell you, I work with some of the most incredible independent schools in the entire country. And I have seen some of the most amazing technology centers, some of the most beautiful schools, campuses in general. One of our schools, I can actually literally look out from a room that I often get to teach in and see the entire San Francisco Bay. It's amazing. I've seen amazing science labs. I've seen incredible setups for all sorts of different components, from the arts to sports and so on. Those things make us amazing, right? Those things make your school the school that it is. Well, what you need may differ from those things. And I don't mean to say that it does. And don't get me wrong. For some of you, you may say, look, that is what makes us us, and that is what we need, and that's fine. All I need you to do is tell me exactly what it is that you need, and then it's my job to figure out a way to maintain that and make that happen, or for that matter, any other business continuity professional. So put differently, if you are evaluating your whole school and you say, here are the top 15 things that we need in order for us to be XYZ school, the goal of the continuity plan is to find a way to keep those 15 things. Oftentimes when I ask that question, especially of academic leaders as opposed to business leaders, the answer is, we need the social culture, we need our staff and faculty, we need the incredible energy that emanates from our building, our walls, our students. And those things are absolutely intended to be on that list. And those are things that we have to find a way from a continuity perspective to ensure that we can maintain. And so when I hear those answers, sometimes people say, but you probably don't mean that. You probably mean, like, do we need the science lab? And that's not at all what I mean. Although certainly if you say I need a science lab, then I'll make sure that we keep that or find a new one. But I do really want to challenge you to be thinking about not just the physical things that you need, but also the culture, the energy, the other components that make your school your school. And then once you've established that, what do we need versus what makes us amazing, or what do we need versus what do we want? Well, the next question then is, how long can we live without what we want for? So if we've decided that our school is really a leader in performing arts, and so we have to have the ability to conduct these performing arts in this specific way, well, you've neglected your athletic program in doing that, right? And that's okay. But how long until you can't do that anymore? Or worse, perhaps because of how strong you are in performing arts, you've said, you know what, that's the necessity, but you've ended up neglecting math, science, and other general studies. And I'm making all sorts of things up here. But if you go down that road, at what point is it that other things start to be sacrificed and start to put you in jeopardy of not being the school that you are today anymore? And so that's the next question to ask. Can we live without this for 6 months, 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 years? And in fact, one of the things that I will do as an early on exercise with most of the schools that I will work on a business continuity plan with is I'll actually say, I want you to write down 7 seconds. What can you not live without for 7 seconds? And people almost always just put oxygen, maybe water. Then I'll say, all right, 7 minutes. And that's when this process really begins. Then I'll say 7 days. Okay, 7 weeks. Okay, 7 months. All right, 7 years. And when I think about the overall continuity process and the evolution of a school post-resumption or post-restoration, it really is something that we will see the effects of, not just for 7 seconds, not just for 7 minutes, not just 7 days. You get where I'm going. We see the results and we're still grappling with some of them 7 years later. And so it's very much worthwhile to be thinking about the absolute core necessities in those terms. What do I absolutely need for 7 seconds? Well, that's just basically keeping me alive. Well, what do I do for 7 minutes? Believe it or not, still keeping me alive, search and rescue, things like that. Well, once we get into 7 hours, we actually expand a little bit more. Now we're talking about things that start to resume our education. And as we get into 7 days and 7 weeks and so on, you can see how some of these things absolutely must come back. And my favorite question, and what I actually spend a lot of my time doing, is coming up with all of these answers, right? I need X, Y, and Z in order for us to be this school. Well, then I like to say, what does your senior leadership think about that, right? Because every once in a while, you have this great perspective on who you are and what you need and what absolutely must exist in order for your school to be your school, but your leadership team disagrees. And when that happens, what ends up, a couple of things may happen. One, your leadership team says, hey, we're not going down this road, so you stop the business continuity process altogether. Two, your leadership team says, yeah, I'll do it, but I don't want to. And then we end up with them not being really supportive of the process, and that can, generally speaking, we can still get the work done, but it's not always as good, and it certainly doesn't make it as strong or as impactful. And then, of course, there are some other results that come from that too. They may just say, hey, you know what, I think you're wrong, and here are the 5 things that I think we can't live without, and you may have to argue a little bit to figure out what you can mutually decide is true, and then we'll go from there. When we talk about communication in any emergency, we talk about the need for communication, right? And in fact, in every debriefing that I do, after every drill, after every real emergency that we respond to, one of the things that comes up that the school, the business, the person, the whoever didn't do as well as they could have is communication. In fact, so much so that at the beginning of some of our responses, depending on the type of response that we have, I will say to everybody, listen, our goal today is to be good at communication. If we don't fix this emergency, I don't care. But if we can communicate, we've been successful. And it's not always appropriate. And sometimes the emergency absolutely needs to be fixed. And so that's just irrelevant. But at times I'll start the process that way. And at times we're actually successful at good communication, but we still could have improved. And that is never more true than with the continuity team. The continuity team needs to have a firm understanding for every part of your school. And this is one of those things that can be challenging for the tech side, the business side, the ed tech even to some extent, because those people are all staff. They may not have that understanding of what your students look like. They may not have that understanding of what class looks like. They may need to really use or leverage somebody from faculty to help them understand what actual restoration or actual return to normal school could look like. And that's totally fine if that's the case. You just need to be able to communicate to them that that's what they need. But they need to truly understand every part of the school, and that's going to start at the top, go all the way down. They need to understand every grade level and what their core needs are. They need to understand the technology, obviously, that goes along with each. So if you're, let's say, a split campus, you have elementary school on one and middle upper on another, they need to have a keen understanding for what systems, programs, technology, and stuff needs to be available for the elementary school to work. And if that's different for one reason or another for the middle and upper school, they need to know that too. But they need to do all of this communication, and they need to make sure they have this keen understanding months and months before the emergency happens. And in fact, most continuity plans will take somewhere from I'll say 1 year to 18 months. At times they are certainly done faster. At times they go on longer. I'm actually working on one right now that's been going on for about 2.5 years, and it's with a great big company that it's just too big to go any faster, and that's okay. But we need to make sure that we get far enough into the continuity process before the emergency happens that it can actually be valuable. Among the things that they're going to be setting up, and among the things in the continuity plan, are going to be a list of vendors that they can call on. So transportation vendors, school buses, food vendors, people to actually deliver food so that we have it wherever we are. There's the obvious structural vendors like structural integrity folks and building consultants and things like that. There's folks that will help just move a few people. Believe it or not, Uber has found its way onto some of our continuity plans. So they're going to have lots of those vendors on there, and those are probably the group that get forgotten about the most. And so what'll happen is we get all those vendors on that list, and that's great. And then we forget to communicate to them. And so 2 years later, we call them up and we say, hey, we actually need to use you right now. We need a school bus. And they say, oh, well, we haven't talked in 2 years and we forgot about you. And no, we're not available, by the way. So once you've communicated once, and once you've established the plan and you've gotten everything set up and ready to go, there's still more work to be done. And that really has more to do with the maintenance and the oversight of the program than anything else. But it's got to be done, and it's got to be done consistently. Once the emergency happens, the continuity folks should actually not be communicating or working with your school very much at all. They're very much still working on your behalf, but they really shouldn't be communicating to anybody on campus or anybody else for that matter, because their jobs have to be to 100% immerse themselves in the resumption of school. During that time, you, by the way, your sole job and your sole purpose is to actually get students searched and rescued for, provided first aid for, reunified with parents, make sure that they've been accounted for, and so on. So what's really important to call out here is that while you're still managing the emergency, before you've even released kids, the continuity team can be started on figuring out where we're going to go back to school. And albeit that there are certainly circumstances where that's not possible. For example, in the event of a great big lockdown, where perhaps the police are coming to actually help you release and so on and so forth, you may not know whether you're coming back to school tomorrow, and you may not know whether you or your board or anybody else wants to come back to school tomorrow. I get that. In a great big fire, though, where maybe one of our buildings, or let's say even the entire campus, has been impacted, and we know very quickly that we're not going to be able to come back, before the last student is released, the continuity team should really have a plan of action in place for when we're going to go back to school, where, and with what sort of specifics. And then we should be able to communicate that the evening of. And one of the things we talk about a lot with communication, and especially parent communication, is that the immediate emergency communication should always be done by text message and email and things like that, always in writing. But the after action communication, the one where your head of school or somebody from the leadership team should get on the phone and pre-record a message that says, hey, everybody, here's the plan, here's what's happening next, and here's how we're going to keep you safe. That should really happen the evening of the emergency. And in order for that to be an effective communication, the continuity team has to be done with their plan, ready to go, knowing exactly what's going on the next day, or at least put on that image. I will share just a quick story, and this is funny more than it is anything else, to be honest. Many of you know we moved offices about almost a year ago. And about 6 months into our new office, we discovered that we had a broken pipe under the building. And of course, we discovered it because both upstairs and downstairs bathrooms were getting backed up, and there were all these other problems, and plumbers kept coming out. They just couldn't figure it out. Well, finally we did, and we figured out in a frightening way, because they actually put a camera down in one of the pipes and said, here's all the problems. Anyway, they said to us, you can't use the bathrooms anymore. And by the way, we're not going to have anybody who can actually fix this problem for somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks. And so our facilities team got on the phone and was trying to figure out how we could get the problem solved. And immediately, one of our consultants arranged for porta potties to be delivered. And of course, they weren't just your regular porta potties. They were great, movie style porta potties. They were quite nice. In fact, maybe even better than what we were using before. But they were delivered, they were set up. And before the plan of action was in place for when the problem was going to be solved, these were here, and a message had already gone out to all of our employees saying, hey, this is what we're going to do for the next X number of days. And it was fascinating, and it was really incredible. But when we talked through it afterwards, somebody said, well, that is our job as part of the continuity team, to make sure that we're able to resume and or maintain normal operations. And as a result, we were out of bathrooms for a number of hours instead of a number of days. Also, as a result, we were able to get the repair done much more quickly, and in the end, we probably didn't need to do that. But nonetheless, it was an incredible sort of story of our own of how something that's a really small emergency can actually cause some big problems. Obviously, if you can't go to the bathroom, that's not good. And how a single person or a group of people can manage it. And for many of our schools that have activated continuity teams in the past, it's not great big lockdowns. It's not really big fires that wipe out an entire building. It's something much more akin to that. Something where pipes burst, or rooms are no longer accessible, or something weird happens on the third floor. Or maybe there was a chemical spill in the chem lab, and so we just can't use that part of the building anymore. So all sorts of different options, all sorts of different ways that these can come to fruition. What's imperative is that when you build this plan, that it's broad enough that it covers any emergency that might disrupt any of your normal operations. So step one is really to figure out what normal operations look like for you. Does school normally take place from 8 to 3:15? If so, does it ever go beyond that? Probably. Do students ever get there early? Probably. So what does that normally look like for you? And you literally just start with that. And what do we need to have happen during that time? And then you can work your way in. Sometimes, and especially on the West Coast, the challenges for schools can be our air conditioner system went out, or our heating system went out on the East Coast. Unfortunately, we don't get to experience that problem. For others, it's, our gate went out and we can no longer get people into the front gate. So how do we move this around? And then again, of course, we're planning and thinking about that really, really big emergency, that great big earthquake, great big fire, great big lockdown, whatever it is. But we're activating the plan in much, much smaller emergencies. And frankly, you should activate your continuity plan a couple of times a year, because things happen. And if you go to your facilities team and say, hey, when was the last time something happened that disrupted our operations? My guess is that they'd say yesterday. And if they didn't, if you really spent some time thinking about what some of those things might be, you probably could end up with an answer of yesterday. So if that's the goal, that's the role, that's sort of all the communication that goes along with the continuity team, what are the challenges that go along with it? Generally speaking, the biggest challenge that the continuity team faces is the lack of an actual plan. And so a continuity team might actually form and come together and respond to an emergency, and they might be able to actually endure the whole thing, get you back into school, and never have practiced or planned for it. And as a safety consultant, that is the last thing I want to tell you, because then what you will do is not create a continuity plan. But I realize that. I realize that some of you may have been in environments in the past where something had to happen and a group of people came together, formed a task force, and they got it done. And so for those instances, I applaud you. I certainly would love to hear about those things. The challenge with that is that without a solid plan in place, we can't count on that. And what I want you to be able to do is I want you to be able to say, hey, if something happens tomorrow, if something happens in 6 months, if something happens in 9 months, whether it's as small as a power outage or as big as a great big lockdown that impacts my entire neighborhood and we can't drive into a half-mile radius of our school, this is what we're going to do. And the power of that capacity, I mean, just the capacity of being able to say that is so impactful and has so much power associated with it that I can't articulate it. I'll tell you that most of the time, your insurance auditors, when they come out, will say, hey, do you have a business continuity plan in place? Or they'll say, hey, do you have a disaster recovery plan in place? For all intents and purposes, from our perspective, those two things are one and the same. By sort of everybody else's standards, the disaster recovery plan tends to be much more focused on tech, and the business continuity plan tends to be much more focused on the business. For us, what we do is we create a single document and test a single plan that is one and the same. So it will handle the DR and the BCP, or the disaster recovery and the business continuity element of it. So the biggest challenge, like I said, is just lack of a plan. The next is that sometimes your leadership team won't get on board with you. And so in spite of you saying, hey, this is what we want, this is what we need, this is what we ought to have, they just won't do it for one reason or another. And finally, the fact that they may or may not have a full team behind them to help them, to work with them, and to support them. What I like to say is that emergencies always give you the opportunity to say, I'm sorry, we were dealing with that and we didn't deal with it correctly. It was an emergency. And we use that. And for those of you that have worked with us on crisis counseling, or crisis communications rather, for those of you that have worked with us even on non-crisis, but general communication to parents, or anybody else for that matter, one of the things that we often say is this was an emergency and therefore our response was not as perfect as we wish that it would have been. And we oftentimes say that in a time where we're actually looking to show a little bit more emotion and show that we're a little bit more authentic, but we haven't actually made a mistake, believe it or not. But nonetheless, it's a line that's frequently used, and it's true. In an emergency, we have the benefit of being able to say it was an emergency. But continuity, and when we start to look at the restoration process, that is what's remembered, that's what's referred back to, and that's what ultimately sustains an organization. And so it really does need to be perfect. And although there can be some errors that occur inside, right, some things that just you know about, and certainly those things will happen inevitably, we have to put on a really good show for everybody outside, and that's really the challenge. So if there's one thing that I could say, it's create a plan and then test that plan. And in fact, not long ago, I was having a meeting with a great group of folks that said, hey, we have a business continuity plan and here it is. And I said, great. And I said, when was the last time you practiced or you tested this? And they said, never. And every time we complete a business continuity process, although we also do this along the way, we'll provide a tabletop session where essentially we will literally ask senior administrators and anybody else who might be part of the continuity plan to come through this conversation with us and to learn about the process for continuity. And then we actually ask them to go through this tabletop where we say to them, hey, you know what? If you can, or rather, if you lost power right now, what would you do? If you lost internet right now, what would you do? And we create this script document that ultimately creates a smaller, almost customized version of the continuity plan just for them. And so if it's not something that you've done yet, I certainly would challenge you to run a tabletop where you actually work with everybody to come up with this program or this concept that we, for all intents and purposes, will call a script. So you've got some next steps to do. The first and perhaps the most important is that you need to identify who should be on your business continuity team, right? And I will use consistently the term business continuity team because that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to continue the business of the school. And I would suggest that you use the same just because it's helpful for insurance providers and everybody else who may want to look at this. So who should be on your team? And again, remember those 3 groups of people or maybe 3 people. Identify how they'll work, who they'll respond to, and exactly what they're going to be doing when it comes time to actually create or activate this plan. Then take a look at 3 to 5 local schools that you can leverage. And I look at generally schools within 5 miles as schools that are great. And then I also want to look at schools, and this is especially true on the West Coast with earthquakes. I want to look at schools that are maybe 10 to 15 miles away as well. So maybe 2 or 3 that are within 5 miles, and then another 1 or 2 that is around 15 miles away. And I have found that some folks will actually invite other schools from very far away. For example, one school that I work with in LA has a partnership with a school in San Francisco. And there's certainly some benefit to that. If it's a school that's similarly run or managed to yours, and it's a school that has a lot of the same concepts in place and thinks the same way, maybe politically is similar, culturally is similar. One of the things that you can incorporate into your plan, embrace yourselves for this, it sounds crazy, but what you can do is swap data with them and have them communicate on your behalf in the event of an emergency, knowing that they're gonna be much calmer, they're gonna be much less impacted by any sort of physical manifestation of that emergency. And so for that reason, they may be a good resource for you. Then take that sort of thought process and move it into action. And what I'll ask you to do is in the next 30 days, go from thinking that, hey, this is a great idea, which hopefully you do, to, hey, this is what we're going to do about it. And 30 days is really too long. If I were you, my suggestion would be, or well, if I were me, my suggestion would be that by the end of this week, that you at least have a sketch down on paper for who's going to be on your team. You have a general concept of who they're going to be working with, and you reach out for help if you need it. You watch this webinar again, you share this webinar with them, or we've got some good continuity resources on our website as well that you can use. You start to actually frame a plan, and I would suggest that you do that before the end of this week. And then within 30 days that you actually have an action plan that will carry you through the end of this school year and potentially summer and into next year. My goal is that for each of you that have participated in today's webinar, that by the end of the year, you have enough in place to keep technology and ed tech working over the summer on this plan. So if you're on any sort of schedule that allows you a break over the summer, more power to you. I'm jealous. Oftentimes technology and ed tech are not. In fact, sometimes that's when those two are even busier than normal. But I would challenge you to try and do enough this school year that by the time you get to summer, that there's actually still opportunity, there's still some room to grow for them over the course of the summer. Now, I'm going to answer a couple of questions here that came in, and before I actually talk to you about our gift, I'll tell you quickly about it. So as a gift for being on today's webinar, we're offering something very different than normal. We're offering a business continuity assessment, and it looks like we've actually chatted that out or put that up on the sticky notes on the top of your screen, and we just chatted it out as well. So you can click that. It'll walk you through a little bit more information about what our continuity assessments will look like. And through that, we hope that you'll be able to feel comfortable with the concept, and obviously then we'll come out and meet with you, talk with you, and learn more about what you've done in the past, and potentially provide that sketch or help you provide that sketch for how you could move forward this year, and ideally even faster. That said, there are a couple of really good questions. Candice, it looks like there was a question about why don't you recommend, let's see, why do you not recommend the CFO on the team? Really good question. And it really depends on the type of leader that your CFO is. If your CFO is somebody who is actively engaged and very hands-on in day-to-day operations, then they can be part of the planning team. But generally speaking, that person really needs to be with the rest of the command center and actually working with the command center on the emergency. And the rest of the continuity team needs to be off doing their thing to get us back into the buildings as quickly as they can. So put differently, if I have my CFO spread too thin, they can't do both well, and I'd rather have that person focused on the resumption of, or sort of the correction of the emergency live with students, with staff, with faculty, with communication, because more often than not, they're part of that senior leadership team, and so that's where they're best used. My continuity team, on the other hand, should really be not senior administrators, although one or two certainly doesn't hurt, but primarily not senior administrators, so that they can stay focused and dedicated to the work that they're going to be doing. Thank you. That was a great question. It looks like the next question came in from Connie. Oh no, Connie, it looks like you were having a hard time seeing slides. Hopefully that improved for you. Our apologies. It looks like that got bumped over to me to answer. It looks like that does it for questions that have come in today. So what we'll do is, over the course of the next couple of days, for those of you that are looking for the continuity assessments, we'll be reaching out to set those up. What's neat about the continuity assessments is that we can do those remotely, and so they're much faster to schedule. Oftentimes for our regular safety assessments, it'll take at least a week or two to get those on the calendar with a consultant in your area. The continuity assessments, we should be able to get scheduled for you early next week. We've actually got about 8 blocks out, so I think we should be okay on that. That being said, as always, we can't tell you how much we appreciate you being with us. And next week, we're going to be coming back. I'll actually also be leading next week's webinar, talking about the counseling team. And for many of you, that's a team that, again, you either perhaps might not know it existed, or perhaps you just look at your school counselor and say, hey, that's you. But we're going to talk a little bit about what crisis counseling looks like, and we'll talk about some real case studies. So next week's going to be kind of a challenging webinar, because we will be talking about some really tough things: student injury and illness, faculty injury and illness, and even death. But we'll be talking about how some schools in various parts of the country have managed those, and some really great ways to manage really bad situations. So I can't wait for that one. It's weird, but I can't. And beyond that, actually at the end of next week's webinar, we will be presenting a full schedule for the rest of the year, so that you can learn a little bit more about what's coming. I'm really excited about a couple of the webinars that we've got left. We're going to be talking about a new security program. We'll be talking about Uber and ride shares. We'll be talking about a new product that we actually just discovered not very long ago called Mask It. It's a great product that we think that you'll enjoy. and so on. So without any further ado, I'll say thank you so much for being with us today. I can't wait to see you again next Thursday. In the meantime, we'll see those of you that have signed up for the business continuity assessments probably sooner than that. But everybody else, thank you so much and have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.